Things that give me energy are, in a lot of ways, getting out of the digital space, eating together with friends and family. It's not just nourishment. It is community. It's telling some good dirty jokes, just catching up on life. It's how we are connected to each other. And so food just seems so tangible to me.
Welcome back to another episode of the Force of Nature podcast. Today's guest is Cole Mannix from Old Salt Co-op, a vertically integrated meat company based in Helena, Montana. Today's episode, we cover off how he came to create Old Salt Co-op, the trials and tribulations of setting up a direct-to-consumer or wholesale meat company, and also understanding his ethos behind why he does what he does. So without further ado, let's get into it. Cole, how are you going today?
It's great. Good to be with you.
Can you give the listeners a bit of a background on who you are and how you've got to where you are today?
My name's Cole Mannix, and I am here in Helena, Montana, where I live. I've been here for about 13 years, and also I married a Helena girl. We had gone to undergraduate here from, I think, 2003 to 2007. We were both biology students, and so we kind of moved back. She grew up here, and this is kind of her home base. She's a physical therapist, and she supports us while I kind of do this crazy entrepreneurial task of building a meat company. So I focus full-time on Old Salt Co-op, and I have for the last 4 years, which is a Montana meat company that has some high aspirations, I guess, of kind of getting outside of commodity markets. My background is that I grew up about an hour west of here in the Blackfoot Valley, western Montana. My family has been there since the early 1880s, came from Ireland, and have been managing this place ever since, especially initially, and then eventually for the last 50 years, it's been mostly cattle, certainly some forestry and timber work, but for the most part, that's not commercial. There's been a little bit of commercial logging, but we're definitely in an area where there's only so many merchantable trees. So nowadays it's a lot about fire prevention and making sure that the grassland is robust to grow forage and there's not too much encroachment. And my mom and dad and my aunts and uncles and my siblings and first cousins are all ranching together. So they are all on the ranch. We have a small meat program called Mannix Beef. Maybe we do about 300 beef a year, like in the immediate vicinity, and that vicinity, meaning like a couple of markets or towns that are about an hour away that we'll sell direct to consumer, grocery stores, restaurants. And then cow-calf, for the most part, selling either calves or yearlings is the bread and butter of the ranch. That's how we make a living. And I grew up following Dad and my aunts and uncles around to holistic management, international meetings, and Allen Savory meetings, a thing called Ranching for Profit. And, they would meet with peers in the industry from different parts of the states and compare notes and try to make their businesses better and try to get the inputs out. And so I definitely grew up in that context, but didn't know what I wanted to do. Went to school, studied biology and then philosophy, and then I did a master's degree in theology. I was interested in just a wide range of things without such a career in mind, but I eventually kind of came to really feel that the food system and the food economy was really at the root of what I cared about, certainly where I had come from, but also a recognition that we faced so many existential challenges, from the climate to, even if the climate was not changing, just an incredible threat that we in our society poses to ecological integrity, from biodiversity to just not fragmenting land at the rate that we're currently doing it. And, that how we use land and either taking care of it or not can spill into how we take care of our fellow human beings, too. Like if we're exploiting land, we're pretty much exploiting everything. So how can we clean up our act a little bit? How can we just in our backyard make it so that good stewardship of natural resources and wildlife and living systems is economically viable? Bringing that economic side together with ecological health. So out of school, I went to work. My dad and 119 other ranches got together in a thing called Salt of the Earth Ranchers Cooperative. And we wanted to build a brand and get outside of commodity. And we built that around cull cows. So I went to work for them, not really having business background. And that failed after 5 years. But I got a bath in the meat industry. We had a chance. We had some wins. But I got a bath in how hard the meat industry is, a little bit of a bath in business. And I took that experience and I went into a policy group organization called Western Landowners Alliance. And we worked on Endangered Species Act, Farm Bill, state wildlife migration policy, everything that kind of had to do with the enabling conditions of managing land well, I guess. And had a great experience there, but ultimately sort of felt, man, policy change is so slow. How do I maybe work more right here at home, like where my connections are, where my family is based, where I feel like it's my zone of influence. And so during COVID of 2020, started writing a business plan for Old Salt Co-op. And that's kind of how I got into this startup phase I've been in now for 4 years.
That's awesome. It's quite a journey. And to specifically go back into the meat industry after you had that first initial experience, what was the catalyst to have another crack at that? Did you feel like you took some good learnings away from your initial stint?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was many things. At the time, my family was wrestling. We had built this little program. So that my family's place, it is about a third owned land and a third private lease and a third public lands. And overall, the operation is about 50,000 acres. We run maybe 1,300 mother cows, some yearlings at any given time. We have about 1,000 sheep maybe 1,500 sheep during the July 1 through September 1 for weed control, but we don't own those sheep. And we were wrestling with, okay, for 20 years, we've had this little bitty meat program that has gotten complex, maybe $1 million in sales. And yet it's so small that it barely has, meat is a small margin. So having the cash flow to really justify paying, the human labor to manage the complexity that it's basically just, it either needed to grow a lot in order to start generating enough margin that you could pay the people it took to run it, or step back from it. And the family desperately didn't want to step back from it because despite it not being a big chunk of our economics, it was a lot of what brought my generation back and got us interested, I think. Partially just because it was the first time we ever thought of ourselves as food producers instead of just cattle producers. Meeting people at the farmers markets, meeting customers, realizing that there was so much appetite out there in the public for like land management, interested in the full gamut from nutrition and nutrient density to how we manage soil and, whether we have dung beetles and, how is the fishery doing and how are the grizzly bears and the wolves that are, part of these landscapes doing. And so I was seeing, that the family was realizing, okay, we want to grow beyond this little 300 head per year program. We don't like a lot of things about the commodity food system. And yet, man, if we're going to build our own processing plant, which we really needed if we were going to market direct to consumer and online at any scale, because our packer was 2 hours away. And we knew, we figured out a few little things with local marketing, but we're really not marketers, like we're ranchers. So the family was wrestling with this question. So I kind of came to them and said, what if we work together with some other producers and build a brand? And it won't be based on us being expert marketers, but we'll build a hell of a marketing team and we'll raise money together. We'll make sure a processing facility can stay busy together by making sure it's processing livestock from many farms and ranches. And what do you think about that? It would not be built around our family name because we want people to feel like many of us are participating in a brand that we can all, get behind. And it also just felt like, as much as Western Landowners Alliance and my interest in policy had talked about ecosystem services, recreation, government payment programs, other ways to bring revenue to working lands, food is still, even on those operations that are particularly diversified, food is still, agricultural products are still 2/3 of the income, my experience, often. And so it's not like food is becoming sort of the obsolete. It's always going to be important. And it's a major part of the revenue stream. And yet we have so little opportunities to diversify and have more people to sell to. It's so hard to get into wholesale accounts and move any kind of volume. We have a very kind of constricted industry where it's sort of now about maintaining power and the status quo downstream of the ranches, from the packer to the distributor to the retailer. And the one thing that I could picture, things that give me energy are in a lot of ways getting out of the digital space, eating together with friends and family. It's not just nourishment. It is community. It's telling some good dirty jokes, just catching up on life. It's how we are connected to each other. And so food just seems so tangible to me, rather than, some app or the next scheme to capitalize on pasture insurance, or can we sell voluntary or involuntary or regulated carbon credits? It's like, hey, food is just so tangible. Montana has enough population now where we could start a couple little food businesses, and I think there's appetite for it. Let's do that because it's us getting together, So I think that's what it was. It's just like, man, if I want to get out of digital land and all my Zoom calls and flying to DC for policy meetings, food and experiences are right here in front of me, and everybody's hungry for it. Everybody's hungry for connection.
Absolutely, and I think there's something to be said when you're sharing good food with good friends and having good conversation. You always remember that rather than doing something digitally. And like that harks back to that community. And we need farmers 3 times a day. And it seems a bit far-fetched that they're the ones struggling to make money and be profitable because of the current system. And it seems even more crazy that to even try break in and do direct-to-consumer is such a struggle for you guys as well, or for any farmer, no matter where they are in the world. Whereas it's almost like the food system needs to kind of go back to what it was, where local communities are fed by their local farmers rather than heading down to the supermarket every time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there are reasons why, it's so complex to manage land. And, it really is a full-time job and then some. And I've got 6 generations of 6 members of the 6th generation of my family, and 3 full-time members of the 5th generation who are fully engaged in this livestock operation without a lot of free time. And so there's also something to some scale. I don't like, in our part of the world, having big ranches that are thousands and even tens of thousands of acres is a big reason why you can have migratory elk herds and pronghorn and grizzly bear habitat and wolves. It's not as if I see everybody has to sell at the farmer's market. It's like there's some reasons to have, like, if you're going to have a processing facility that is going to meet regulatory compliance, it's going to cost a lot of money to build, and that means you're going to have to put a lot of units through it to pay it back. And if you're going to work with restaurants, they don't have all day to work with 80 farmers to get what they need. So it's important for them to be able to order from a distributor, and for, you need cold storage. Like, there is a reason for this middle market infrastructure. I think the way we have thought about it is, instead of the big 4 packers in our neck of the woods becoming the big 8, like, what if we get 70 or 80 that are meaningful scale and medium size, and maybe from there 700 would be real nice. And that would be a food system that was much more intimate and much more diversity of opportunity, distribution of opportunity. I think people would have a chance to be more connected intimately to their place if all the restaurants weren't named Hardee's or McDonald's, and you had just interesting Main Street food establishments. And if there were many distributors, not, again, there's something to scale. So not many, many, many tens of thousands, but, if we're down to like a few companies in such a huge country, boy, you'd be a lot more resilient and a lot more regionally connected if we had 70 or maybe 700. And that, to me, it's just a more beautiful version of the food system. Having redundancy, that makes you more resilient. Then it also, I think it might be a richer life. So I think the family ranch knew, like, we're not going to be able to create that. And if Cole wants to come back to the ranch, like I did, we all knew, okay, that's just going to spread us thinner, because I'm not really adding new revenue. Like, the land has a certain carrying capacity when it comes to eating grass. We know we could add a sheep enterprise and be okay, and actually produce more with the same resource base without sheep and cattle competing 1-to-1. But I'm not going to be able to sell that sheep meat for enough unless I go create a meat company and the ability to process it. So I sort of felt like, hey, I can do more as a person who grew up in ranching and cares about it, and whose wife would rather live in town, by doing something that's ranching adjacent. And even though I personally was not a specialist in all the parts of the meat industry, I'm good at finding people, and I'm good at recognizing that it takes a lot more than me. And so from our culinary director, our first hire, who was just deep in food and loved every bit of it and wanted to live here, to Graham Moore, our director of operations, to Logan Smith. She's now our CRO, and she's just a tremendously talented person. Like, I can find those people, and we can we don't know everything, but we might be able to build a little brand that can move meat and connect ranchers to the customer. So
absolutely. And so far, it looks like you're having some success at that. Do you want to tell us a bit more about the Old Salt Co-op business model? Like, how have you set it up in terms of how you take the meat and where do you distribute it through?
Yeah, so a lot of it was, trying to begin with the end in mind, and the end for us is not to become. We had looked, for example, at a group called Country Natural Beef, which is a pretty successful cooperative in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, like Oregon, Washington, and Montana has quite a few members. Even some of the Old Salt members have marketed cattle through them, and they had survived in a cutthroat meat industry, in a very challenging meat industry for 40 years. And we admired them for a lot of reasons, but they also they got to a scale with 80 to 120 producers at any given time, 150 to 200 million in sales, clients that looked a lot like big, industry clients, Whole Foods, Burgerville, but they had not succeeded in delivering a better margin overall. Maybe a little bit of evening out the peaks and valleys of the commodity market, but not really a better margin. So we didn't quite want that. We weren't trying to create another version of that. We already have that. We wanted something that really could get a better margin and kind of increase other opportunities down the road for things like beyond beef itself, perhaps bison, perhaps lamb, perhaps some agritourism. So we didn't see wholesale as a starting point. We saw direct to consumer. And we thought if we were going to build a processing facility, which we had to do if we were going to be anything more than a tiny meat company, that we probably needed to run about not less than 3,000 head per year through it. And wholesale was challenging. And so a lot of those 3,000 head either had to come from direct-to-consumer e-commerce sales or from processing for other small, very small third-party brands. So we set out to be direct-to-consumer, and we had a little bit of a base built up from Mannix customers, maybe 600 customers that Mannix sold to regularly. And so Old Salt was built to absorb their little customer base. And for those customers, we deliver on a route system in Montana. So on a Saturday, we drive to several communities, drop off the meat that they've ordered online. And then the next Saturday, we go into a different geography, and then it starts over. And then the rest ship online via, cold ship via the mail. So we knew direct to consumer was where the sufficient margin was. And we've still say that 5,000 customers is our goal. And today there's probably 1,000 customers who are regularly buying. Wholesale will be part of it, but on a much smaller and also a little bit later down the road basis. Like eventually you want the ability to, here's 2,000 pounds of ground beef wholesale. But it takes time to have the USDA processing facility capacity to fulfill to those wholesale clients. And you don't want to be beholden where one client is a big percentage of your business. And then maybe they go away or they push back on price and you're left with a bunch of animals in a supply chain. So we didn't want to be vulnerable to wholesale. We wanted to grow gradually. And still today we have zero wholesale. And that's except to our own 2 wholly owned restaurants. And that's because I don't have the inspected facility yet. But when we do go wholesale, it will be focused not on grocery, but on Montana restaurants that are not chains, but are kind of the same owners. Maybe there's 2 or 3 locations, or maybe they're one-offs, but they're catering to people who are interested in local foods and who are interested in some connection of the food to the landscape that they're in. So the reason I mentioned that is if you're going to go direct to consumer, then the question is, how do you scale it enough to matter? And so we thought, well, what if we just try to test our concept here and see how much appetite there is for this locally? We started a burger joint. It's a smash burger joint. We cooked our fries in beef fat in tallow. So we have these tallow fried potatoes, and we went away from seed oils, which is something that I think we kind of believe that animal fats are perhaps a better source of fat, but it's kind of gone away. And there's a lot of traction in the market right now for that way of thinking. And so we did that at our first location. And then we more recently, that one we leased, and we still lease this kitchen in a bar where we didn't have to take on much risk. We just renovated a kitchen for $40,000. They own the liquor license. They run the bar, and we serve food to it. And it works really good. The next one we did was the one that where I met you at the Union, which is a butcher shop and a wood-fired grill and a way bigger lift. We spent $3.5 million to buy, renovate, and launch that business. None of this is our money. We don't. This is all investor dollars that we've raised. we were a group of producers that didn't have much cash. Total to date, we've raised $75,000 from our producers. So my mandate was, hey, let's get a capital intensive business. We're not going to put our ranches up against loans, and we're not, neither are we going to have much capital to contribute. So we're going to have to structure this business in a way that third party equity from outside of ranching, for the most part, is going to have to find it attractive or tolerable to participate if we're going to be successful. So we launched the union in April. We bought a tiny little processing facility in 2022. It was a wild game plant, no slaughter floor, but we thought we could teach ourselves to cut meat there and to know what it costs to process a lamb and a hog and a beef. And so we bring animals to a third-party slaughter. They get killed and chilled, and then we pick up carcasses and bring them back, hang them, and age them, cut, package, and fulfill for that little plant. There's 2 tiny little 1,000-square-foot buildings that we use there. And then meantime, we started holding a festival, and we're about to come up on year 3 of that, which is wood-fired cooking and content surrounding. It's really geared at the generally interested urban public, people that are interested in where their food comes from or how wildlife habitat is managed, or they're trying to get their kids engaged in the landscape. So everything from water to wildlife to food systems. We have a bunch of bands, and we have a bunch of celebrity chef teams, and it's just really fun. It's 3 days. It takes place on my family's ranch. And we think of it kind of as brand building a little bit, partnership building. It's definitely not a big last year we broke even, but we don't see it as a big revenue driver in itself. But I'd love to make those people meet customers. I think it's potentially a really good retention tool. So yeah, Old Salt Co-op is ultimately this vertically integrated meat company that is owned and governed by producers. Producers control the majority of our board. Once our investors get a certain amount of money and they cross a certain hurdle on their investment, which is 6% IRR, now I can share profits, distributions, if we get to this stage, back with producers pro rata, according to how many did they provide, how much of the livestock value that we moved through the company did they provide. And that's, I think, really what I talk to investors or our customers, like, I encourage them to think about, if this business works, what is it feeding? Is it feeding a founder or maybe a founder group and some investors? Or does the success of the business regenerate, like, go to further the mechanism? And I think stewardship takes time and talent and then more time and talent and suffering and just sticking with it. Like watching dad, my aunts and uncles. I've never managed a ranch. I don't know a lot about it. Grew up working on a ranch. And that's it. But what I do know is that it's an artistic endeavor. Every landscape is different. Every set of problems needs a unique set of solutions, and that takes basically love. So that takes enough money, and we've starved producers of money by treating food as a pure commodity, and by basically allowing a food industry that kind of consolidates wealth downstream. And I'm interested in sending it back to the producer. And we also have a worker ownership component. So the way that we're different and the way that we're structured that I'm excited about is that we're actually an LLC, because there were some challenges with the flexibility of a formal cooperative. We're selling, we got manufacturing, we've got an e-commerce brand, we've got restaurants, and we've got an event. And it made it really difficult to track patronage when meat is the only, like at the restaurants, meat is the only thing that comes from our members, not the potatoes or the salads, etc. And some of our workers are co-op owners. They're worker members. But some of them are just going to college and wanting to work at a burger joint. So some of the labor counted as patronage and some of it didn't. So we ended up creating an LLC parent company that owns these subsidiaries, meat processing, meat brand, 2 restaurants, festival. And then in that parent company, we in the operating agreement, we kind of built co-op DNA in terms of who benefits and how do investors sit alongside producers and workers.
Absolutely. It's such a cool model that you're running. Are you finding that both investors and the community are growing an interest in what you're trying to do because of what you're trying to regenerate? Obviously, the ecosystems, and that's a really key part or underlying part of your business, but you're also really keen to give good quality food to the community and create, I guess, better access and resilience within your local food community as well. Is that what the investors are looking at and also the community are now buying into?
I think so. Yeah, I think people are hungry for meaning and connection. And luckily, so far, we've been able to find 28 high net worth individuals who normally would expect more from an investment than we are offering for the comparable level of risk. But they see enough reasons. It's the same is true of myself and our founding team, like our key employees. They're all making less money than they were before they came. And even their upside in the company, which they have, is not nearly as shiny as most entrepreneurs or like early stage employees would expect for a similar level of risk. But again, like both the founders and the investors, they are interpreting wealth more broadly. They want to see more resiliency in the food system. They want unique culinary establishments on Main Street that make the place interesting. They want to have a connection to the lands that they know they depend on, but with which they've only ever had a commodity relationship. So I think we certainly are seeing some interest and traction. And as I mentioned, the restaurant was up for a James Beard nomination, one of 30 in the country. We'll find out more in April. The festival has had 1,800 the first year, 2,800 last year. We're hoping for 3,500 to 4,000 people this year. There's a couple films being made about Old Salt that should come out in late 25 or early 26 that I'm excited about. And hopefully they'll come out. We're in the process. My big project at the moment is building a USDA plant. And so it's designed for 150 head of beef a week. And getting that thing stood up and funded is what occupies most of my time. But hopefully once the media exposure begins to build, we'll have the capacity to fulfill. And that's kind of the juggling act here. But I think we can sense, across the globe, like there's an increasing awareness, and that you can fall into, despair, I think, a lot, or you can feel alienated, and you can feel like, hey, the problems are at such a big scale compared to our little solutions that, man, how is it going to get better? And I almost think you can't allow yourself to, working within your sphere of influence and the things you can affect is empowering. And for me anyway, it has let me kind of get out of some of the darkness of looking at how bleak the trends are and just say, well, I still only have this much time left on Earth. However much it is, it's not that much. I have a certain amount of working life in front of me. What do I want it to look like? And I decided I wanted to kind of be invested in the place I came from and in our backyard. And it feel grateful to get to, give it hell. Regardless of whether it works, it'll still have been, I think, a risk worth taking. I think we all the ranchers around the table felt like, look, the status quo is riskier than any risk we might take. Each one of the ranches, when we had the founding meeting, I think they could each legitimately say, hey, our ecology is stronger today than it was 20 years ago, and we're profitable. But at the same time, each felt that we were likely to be out of business in a generation because essentially the trends in the commodity system. You can grow by getting really creative and leasing land. In some very limited circumstances, you can still find land that can be paid for. I don't see that too much, but it does happen. And so, yeah, it's like, man, this with every unit of production becoming a little bit less valuable, input costs increasing faster than, and I don't mean like chemical and artificial fertilizer. I mean gas. I mean, those input costs increasing faster than, the revenue, the price of even in historically high cattle prices. It's just you've got to be bigger. You got a smaller margin on each unit, and that's the trajectory of the industry. So we've got to decommodify it. Yeah. That's not an option. It's not an opportunity we're pursuing as entrepreneurs. It's sort of it's an existential necessity.
Yeah. I love your ethos all behind this, because we have the exact same issues here in New Zealand, and we've got some record prices at the moment in terms of milk and that, but it's still that same thing. There's not much margin to be made there, which is crazy when you look at the pricing. And I'm very inspired to do something similar to what you're creating over there, because I see the same thing as like, how do we get the farmers together who are thinking like this? Because in a generation, it's all going to just be amalgamated big farms that are commercial operated, and there's no going to be small guys there. And what happens out of that is the ecology suffers as well. So with your model, do the farmers or the ranchers have to do any certifications around like what they're doing from an environmental point of view?
Well, what we agreed on at the founding meeting, and we came together because we already knew each other and our operations pretty well, and we trusted each other. And we knew we would eventually face the question of certifications and how do we memorialize this and formalize it. But Old Salt Co-op could get to our goal, which is a $25 million company, without ever growing more farms and ranches. And the founders raise about 6,000 head of beef cattle between them, some few hundred hogs, few hundred sheep. But they've historically been sheep producers as well and could raise more. And we are built to be able to accept new members. But I think we sort of feel like, hey, if the ethos that we espouse, if we really believe that, then perhaps rather than us growing beyond that kind of what I think is a sweet spot, maybe of 25 million or so, maybe we just go try to share the model with other people who own their own damn company, and they start a brand around a particular landscape with its own group of customers connected with its own middle market infrastructure processing. So I'm not sure, will we eventually have a lot more producers as members? Probably only if we end up growing to be a bigger company than we think we're going to be. And we did agree at the founding meeting that essentially what you have to do no matter what is to have a third-party monitoring system in place across the various ecotypes on the ranch. So that would be, irrigated meadows for the most part in our neck of the woods. That would just be irrigated meadows and then the native grass uplands and timber. And we all use third-party monitoring. And we did just decide to use the Audubon's process. And so this summer, at some point, we will all have gone through that process. But we don't have any of that on our packages. It's just Old Salt meat. Right now, all of our ruminants are grass only, but that's not necessarily because we don't think a ruminant can do well on grain in any context. It's mostly just because that's what the Mannix customer base had come to know, which is a lot of where Old Salt's customer base is too. And that's where we could see all the parts of that process and trust it. But I think there may be a way to do grain in it that is still beautiful. And I think we just got to figure out how it gets fed out on pasture and not in a lot. We have to figure out where's the grain coming from. Is it good provenance or not?
Yeah. And
we've got to make sure that the balance in the diet is, just maintains phytochemical richness for the animals. I would love to see, I just don't think there's one answer to the question of what should a ruminant eat, or there's probably some wrong answers, like not another animal, but I don't think there's that one perfect thing. It's like, okay, did they eat a diverse diet? Did they gain fast enough? Is it a pleasurable eating experience? We have some cattle on feed right now to launch a line that includes grain, and we'll see how that evolves. There's a fella in eastern Montana named Chad Peterson who basically he's aggregating commodities that don't have any kind of special provenance, but he basically bought worn out wheat pasture, and he's using a vertical mixer, and he's feeding wheat mids and feed grade barley out on this 4,000 acres of wheat ground where he's developed water and fencing. And that ground looks really good. So that's a step in the right direction. And the cattle are gaining well, damn near year round. And I think that's cool, even though, we'd be nice to source where those commodities come from a little better, or work with the farmers that are the sources of those commodities on soil health practices and incorporating livestock. But for now, I think that's a good step in the right direction. I'm intrigued by how we can incorporate some of that to our supply chain. Sure.
Yeah. And it's things that always trend. It's like we're in a constant transition, so we can't always have the perfect end result that we want now. We've got to get the farmers on the journey, and it's almost moving along that supply chain, and just do one at a time and then figuring it out, and supporting them with the education to figure out why you want it a certain way, or why soil health is important to them is probably a key part too. So what are you finding has been the hardest part of creating a business like this?
Boy, capital was definitely really freaking hard. But I feel like we're mostly figuring out how to do that. Building the operating agreement, we didn't really have templates to learn from. In this case, I looked for a lot of stuff and I read through a lot of stuff, but we kind of went our own way with how we could build co-op principles into an LLC, and how investors could be sufficiently incentivized to take what is a big risk for less return than they normally get, and to still maintain control amongst the producer group. And then also to still make sure that the producer group has skin in the game. And we kind of built in a mechanism for that as well, where they don't have to put in much up front to buy their one and only one unit of control in the co-op. But if we grow, if they want to sell another 100 units annually, they got to pay for that. And if they want to sell 200 units annually, 300 units annually, they have to pay for that. Now, once they pay for it, they kind of own it forever. But that helps us bring capital in over time to pay back investors or back banks, et cetera. But it really prevented them from having a risk up front. But, this capital thing continues to be, I'm still raising money to build this processing plant that we're working on now. Honestly, regulatory is probably the number one most frustrating and hardest thing. And I'm not even saying federal. It's like we wanted to have food establishments that, promoted and marketed our product in a beautiful way in our community, but it costs $600,000 to $700,000 to buy a liquor license in Montana. Yes. And in some cases, it costs $1.1 million, like in the Missoula markets, the Bozeman markets. And that's not to protect people from drinking too much alcohol. That's because the people who have owned those licenses have lobbied to basically limit the number of licenses so that they increase in value a bunch and so that they have less competition. And it's really hard to have a good food culture if you don't have easily accessible alcohol licenses.
Yeah.
So I know that this is about agriculture, but man, sometimes you start out wanting to do one thing and you realize, man, the Tavern Association is kind of a dam in the river here. Because as much as I mostly just care about the food, I do have to sell alcohol if I'm going to survive as a business and pay $3.5 million for a building and renovate it.
Yeah.
And so for me, the Tavern Association in Montana is pretty damned analogous to the food industry writ large, where the regs are mostly there to protect power. Mm-hmm. But zoning was a huge thing. I've looked at 34 properties to build this meat processing plant and been told no 33 times. The only time I was told yes was the property we now have and are building on, which it took 3.5 years to find that property. In most cases, it wasn't because there wasn't enough water or power or anything. It was just the zoning regulations had been written in a way that never contemplated food processing, because we don't do much of that in Montana, not historically. And so even though in agricultural zoning rules said that, yes, you can process agricultural commodities, it didn't specifically say livestock slaughter, and therefore the county planners could interpret it however they liked, and they liked to not have slaughter. And so it's just really challenging. I finally found a property that was, of a size that I could afford, good road access, 3-phase power, the water situation worked, no zoning, no housing covenants that would prevent it. And after, wasting a lot of money trying to work around the fact that it's just hard to find the property, finally, I think we've solved that. And that's before, there's also been USDA, we've never had that, but there's this custom exempt, retail exempt level of inspection where you can sell direct to consumer anywhere in the country as long as the animal was slaughtered under federal. And then we have what's called custom exempt and retail exempt. But man, we've just wasted a lot of time and money. Some of the regulators interpret us being able to sell to our wholly owned retail establishments, our 2 restaurants, and that counts as direct to consumer, not wholesale. And some of the same people interpret it the opposite, where it's wholesale. And so the amount of paper and meetings we've had to go through, we had all those meetings before we ever built these 2 restaurants and bought that processing facility. But one person disagreed with how the rules were interpreted. And so far they've allowed us to keep doing it. But man, it's crazy the amount of inefficiency there is when you're trying to do something that the system's not used to. So probably that one. I mean, capital and regulation, I would say, to top 2.
Yeah, I'd say they'd probably be the 2 for anyone trying to do it here as well. Are you finding that you're getting better at the capital raising side of it because you have done it for a couple of years now? You're finding that process is getting easier? Sort
of. I think it's easier to say with a straight face today than it was 3 years ago that I know what it looks like for this business to be profitable because we've experienced a month of that. And, cool. New investors can see that we have had some success in raising money. But I would also say the number of people who have the disposable income and also a particular interest in the space, and then take that percentage of people and take, 5% of that because most of the people who have the money, even if they're interested in the space, they still think that it's possible to get incredible returns while saving the world. And so you really do have to find people that understand that you don't really get filthy rich off of taking care of living systems. Like, you don't. It's like, if you do justice to everybody, meaning the microbes and the critters and the ranchers and farmers and the workers, the butchers and the people that work at the restaurant, if you do justice to everybody, there's not these massive, venture capital style surpluses. The only thing you can really do is just to, live a good life, taking care of land and not be filthy rich, which I think is pretty damn good. That seems to me like plenty, but you really have to find a group of people that share those values. Cause a lot of people would sit there and look at me and say, well, that's horseshit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we like to think that maybe the food system and everything will change so that if you do all those good things, you'll be rewarded over time. But we're still a long way from that, I think, at this current point.
And I'm not like against capitalism. I think there is a version of it that can work, and perhaps it's the least worst system we know of.
Yeah.
But I don't think we're going to make billionaires out of regenerative agriculture stakeholders if we're doing diligence to all of the living systems, human beings and the rest of the natural world, that all has to work and all have to be fed enough. And that means we have to redefine what wealth means. And money is only going to be part of what wealth means. But stability, resiliency, community, those are all some really damn cool things. Beauty, those are a big part of a return. But finding people who also see it that way is the trick. Telling the story constantly and just using your network of people. I think that's what I know how to do best. And that's why we have any chance at all, is just because people have been willing to help. And you just grow that network of friendships and people who care about similar things and have some faith.
Absolutely. And I think you do an epic story of actually being able to articulate that in a way that most people can understand, and what that real beauty and that wealth is coming from what you're trying to create for your community as well. So if someone was trying to think about doing this or try to replicate what you were doing, what sort of advice would you give them before they go down this line?
Well, I would say, you can't do it overnight, and you've got to know that it's going to morph as you start leaning into it and creating it. But surrounding yourself with good people. Like, I really had trust that the ranchers who were part of Old Salt were as good as anybody I know at their craft. And I knew they were patient people. I knew that they were, I knew what their definition of wealth was, and that I knew that I could resonate with it. And then the same was true of employees and investors. Like, we've just really stuck to who are those people that have this vision that land is kin, rather than the people who see land as property primarily. So I think that was huge. And then a much less philosophical thing is, man, if you can find one little enterprise that can start to generate cash and give you a little bit of traction and demonstrate some proof of concept, that is huge. And for us, it was the burger joint. It was leasing a kitchen in an area that was populated enough. Helena has about 45,000 people, so enough to eat some burgers. And we wanted to see if they resonated with the story, and could we deliver a good experience at this little restaurant. And that it worked pretty much right away. We found the right spot. It was in enough population, and then Andrew Mace did a great job at the menu. But we got a little lucky, but also we thought maybe where we launched it was its ceiling, but it's actually kept growing over the last 3 years as people hear about it. And it's by far the least complicated enterprise that we launched, and we only risked $40,000. And so, if that, wherever that jumping off point is for somebody, maybe it's a merch brand for T-shirts, or some kind of a shared value system, or can you find one thing that will give you a little bit of traction and then augment that one thing, maybe? But yeah, for me, it was possible because of my wife, Eileen, and her being supportive and having a stable job. I think I've averaged $7 an hour for the last 4 years. And, I don't come from money. So her patience and making it possible this whole time was huge. And yeah, I kind of think that you've got to find that spot of not dreaming too small either. Like, it was really nice to have a small enterprise to run, but we also we care about big change, even though we're humble about our role in the big change, right? We know big change has to happen, and we're just a little piece of that, but we're telling a story about transforming ourselves and a food system to be in right relationship with the land. And that story is relevant to the world. It is just relevant. And people are hungry for, how do I participate? So, sometimes if you're just trying to figure out how to scale a burger joint, maybe you get kind of down in the weeds. But sometimes to solve a problem, I can't remember who said this, but you kind of have to actually zoom out further and say, what is a regional vision that the people that our neighbors and Montanans and can feel excited by? So
absolutely. Yeah. It's that power of just zooming out and looking up a bit to see so you're not just stuck in the weeds looking at that problem, or even getting another set of eyes over something just to give you that different point of view sometimes can be that breakthrough. But I think that's fantastic advice. So I normally finish up these podcasts with a couple of quick-fire questions at the end. The first one is, what's the one thing that you would change about the agricultural industry?
I think it would be, in our country, it would be crop insurance. I would love to see the way that subsidy influences our system.
Yeah,
utterly changed. It's one of the biggest maybe dams in the river.
Yeah, I'm happy we don't have it here.
The other close second would just be, I would change, instead of people thinking of agriculture as what happens on farms and ranches, I would, if I could just snap my fingers and everybody saw them as themselves as an agriculturalist, that would be even bigger.
Yeah, I think we get some really fundamental change around people's eating habits and the support of where they spend their money on food too, if that was to happen. That connection, I feel, is lost. If you were looking back to your younger self, what's one piece of advice you would provide?
A lot of ways to answer that. I think that I probably would have gone to work for a business or maybe a bunch of businesses quicker and stayed in school less long, because I think that it can remain abstract a little too long, and I love that, but I also think that the ability to have gone and worked in a bunch of different businesses on really specific things is a great way to hone your skills. And I think I might have asked too long, like, what is the right thing to do? What will I do with my life? Rather than just putting steady pressure on things that interest you. I did that in some ways, but I think I got tied in knots of what's the perfect kind of career I could create, and a little bit quicker might have just leaned into specific industries and learned and took taken some things. But it's hard to say that that's a legitimate expectation that I could have actually taken my own advice back 20 years ago.
Yeah, I would probably say the same thing to myself, but then I knew I probably wasn't mature enough to have probably worked hard enough to get the benefit out of working for all different businesses like that. And to be fair, I've done it as well. I've worked for a few businesses, and I wouldn't be where I am today without each and every one of those things I learned at each one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what's something that excites you at the moment?
I'm really excited about everything. Honestly, I was just sharing with a friend that how, in a lot of ways, we had both lost a friend in common, a good friend, not too long ago, and then there's been some heavy things happening, and Trump's on the TV talking about tariffs, and he pulled a bunch of government grants and loans that we're dependent on, and it feels a little chaotic, and everything in the world is so explosive and feels so dire. But I honestly feel really excited about exactly where I am. And I think it's a lot of just, I can't control so many of those things. And the idea that by the end of 25 or maybe mid 26, Old Salt could be looking back at 12 months of stability feels amazing to me. Like, we have 50 full-time employees, 75 part-time, overall. Yeah, I feel so grateful for just being able to have a chance to do what we're doing, and I have a inkling that I might be able to spend a little bit more time in the coming maybe 18 months playing guitar and banjo, which I will do anytime I possibly get a chance. Really excited for this festival we have coming up here this summer, and going out and visiting this little processing facility, and it's just, there's an old steel building that's been demoed out so that it's cleaned out. And the idea that in a year from now, we do our things right, we might be processing beef and bison there in a 12,000 square foot addition. Like, boy, 2 years ago, we felt we were trying to do it, and we felt so far away from that. So I'm really excited. Just a little regional food system where I can meet as much meat as possible, and then maybe start trying to instigate it elsewhere. That's exciting to me.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what you're going to do over the next 2 years or more. It's really cool, and see how much the business grows.
I'm really excited to follow this movement more. If I have the chance to pick my head up, follow it out a little bit more nationally, like this chance to meet you and Tanya and the group, and to realize how many people are working on this across the globe and how critical it is. Like, that's a life-giving. I'm excited about that for sure. And it's the idea you can be productive on land and maintain its health or even get it better over time. That is the most hopeful thing I ever heard of. And it's worth, the main question is, what do you serve? That's worth serving.
Yeah, absolutely. It's your North Star, and then you can work from there. And I think people are looking to what you're doing and are being very inspired from across the globe. So I'm sure there'll be opportunity to maybe even visit some people around the world as well and see what they're up to.
That would be, oh man, I'd love that. That'd be cool.
And finally, what is a force of nature to you?
I would say that the thing about love is that it is not big and bold or loud, and it generally is not swift. It's humble. And I think love is the greatest. I think that is how nature exists and subsists. And it's not, it's generally a pretty still, quiet voice. But I think that the idea of creating some big company that's going to save the world is no longer something that interests me. But the idea that a whole bunch of quiet, humble work by millions of people across the globe to get better care of their neighbor and land, that's the force of nature. It's love.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. So if anyone wants to follow along on your journey and what you're doing with Old Salt, what's the best place to keep up to date?
Just our website, probably oldsaltcoop.com, co-op.com. And we have all the social media channels and stuff as well, but I think the website, and if anybody wants to get in touch with me, I see all the stuff. People reach out through the contact form on there, and I see all that stuff. So we're pretty good about getting back to people. And the best thing you could possibly do is to come to Old Salt Festival, which is always the summer solstice in June. Come meet us and just hang out, have a beer, some meat, listen to music, and we'll go from there.
Sounds pretty good to me. And if you're in Montana, I highly recommend going to the restaurants as well. The food's beautiful. Yeah. Thank you very much for your time today, Carl. I really appreciate it.
Great to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
No worries.